Welcome to the History Maps podcast.
Right, so we are jumping right in today.
We are, because in the year 1193, a massive library complex in northern India was, well, it was set on fire by a raiding army.
Yeah, the famous Nalanda University.
Exactly. And the smoke from that complex didn't just mark the destruction of, millions of palm leaf manuscripts. I mean, it marked the near total erasure of an entire religious institution from the very land where it had been born over a millennium and a half earlier.
It is a pretty stark historical moment.
It really is. So the mission for you listening today is to trace that entire trajectory. We are mapping out the history of Buddhism in India. This is a core installment of our Indian history series.
And it is a massive timeline to cover.
It is, yeah. We need to understand how a localized movement of wandering ascetics in the 5th century BCE transformed into this colossal Pan-Asian institution.
Right, and also dissect the mechanics of why it nearly vanished entirely from its birthplace on the Indian subcontinent.
Exactly. And finally, we will examine how it experienced a highly specific modern resurrection in the 20th century.
So to really understand the magnitude of that fire at Nalanda, we have to go back to the spark, right?
Yeah, we have to travel back to the 5th century BCE to the Indo-Gangetic Plains.
Right, because that socio-political landscape is the crucial starting point here. I mean, the 5th century BCE in northern India was a period of intense structural transformation.
We are looking at a landscape dominated by what are called the Mahajanapadas, right?
Yes, exactly. And if we break that term down, it essentially means great realms or great republics. There were 16 of these powerful, shifting political entities stretching across the fertile plains of the Ganges River.
So not just small villages anymore.
No, not at all. You have to picture a society transitioning from these semi-nomadic pastoral tribal units into settled agrarian and highly urbanized kingdoms.
Right, because iron tools were suddenly clearing out dense forests.
Exactly. Agricultural surplus was exploding and cities were rising rapidly. And the prevailing religious framework attempting to govern this rapidly changing world was Brahmanism.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Right.
Brahmanism. This is a system rooted in the Vedic texts, dating back to roughly 1500 BCE, right?
Yeah, that is the general time frame.
But how did it actually function on a day-to-day basis for the people living in these Mahajanapadas? Because it wasn't a system where you simply, went to a temple to pray quietly.
No, definitely not. It placed a heavy emphasis on incredibly complex, highly specific physical rituals.
Right.
And it had strict social hierarchy and relied on the absolute exclusive spiritual authority of the Brahmin priests.
It was essentially an intensely performative and, exclusive system.
Totally. The core of Vedic Brahmanism was the fire sacrifice, the yash.
And these weren't just simple little offerings, right?
Oh, no. They were vast, expensive, logistically complex rituals. They involved the precise pouring of ghee into fires, the exact chanting of Sanskrit mantras, and often the sacrifice of animals.
And the belief was that these rituals literally maintained the cosmic order.
Exactly. The idea was if the rituals were not performed perfectly, the universe would literally fall into chaos.
That is a lot of pressure.
It is. And here's the critical mechanism, right? Only the Brahmin caste possessed the purity, the inherited right, and the highly specialized knowledge of Sanskrit required to actually perform them.
So it was an entirely closed loop. You couldn't simply decide to, read the Vedas or perform the rituals yourself to secure a good harvest or a favorable afterlife.
No, you absolutely couldn't.
It required the Brahmin priests as necessary, compensated intermediaries. But the ground was shifting beneath their feet, largely because of economics, right?
Yes, economics changed everything. With the rise of these new cities, the region was seeing the emergence of a highly mobile merchant class.
Right, and they were operating within a developing physical cash economy using early punch-marked coins.
Yeah, these merchants were traveling vast distances across the plains, trading goods, and, accumulating significant wealth.
And as their material power grew, they began seeking alternatives to the esoteric, exclusive, and highly expensive rituals of the Brahmins.
Because they wanted a spiritual framework that aligned better with their mobile, cosmopolitan lives, not one tying them to the rigid, static caste hierarchy of the agrarian villages.
Exactly. And right into this friction steps Siddhartha Gautama.
And the timing is highly specific here.
Yeah, Siddhartha Gautama, who had become known as the Buddha, emerged from the Shakya Republic.
Which was located on the northern periphery of this Vedic heartland.
Right, and he grew profoundly disillusioned with the prevailing rituals, the animal sacrifices, and the rigid caste distinctions of Brahmanism that, dictated a person's spiritual worth based entirely on their birth.
So his response was to articulate a path to liberation that emphasized direct, rigorous personal experience and mental cultivation over those external, priest-led rituals.
Let's break down the mechanics of what he actually taught because it is highly systematic.
It really is.
The core tenets he introduced are framed almost like a medical diagnosis. You have the Four Noble Truths. First, the observation that human existence is fundamentally characterized by suffering or dissatisfaction, which is called dukkha.
Right. The diagnosis.
Yeah. Second, the diagnosis that this suffering is caused by craving and attachment. Third, the prognosis that there is a way to achieve the cessation of this craving.
And then comes a prescription.
Exactly, the prescription, which is the Eightfold Path. This is a practical, ethical, and mental guide. It encompasses right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration.
And the ultimate goal of all of that is achieving nirvana.
Which literally means the blowing out of the fires of craving, right?
Yeah.
Resulting in a release from the endless cycle of birth and rebirth known as samsara.
What's fascinating here is that the systematic nature of those teachings is exactly why they resonated so deeply. If we connect this to the bigger picture of the time, the socioeconomic environment provided the perfect fertile ground for what we call the Sramana tradition.
Sramana means one who strives or renunciate, right?
Yes. These were seekers who physically left ordinary householder society. They went out into the forest to find spiritual truths through severe asceticism, deep meditation, and philosophical debate.
Explicitly rejecting the supreme authority of the Vedas and the Brahmin priests.
Exactly.
To use an analogy here, if we think of Brahmanism as a closed proprietary operating system restricted to a few elites who held all the administrative passwords, like the Sanskrit language and the ritual knowledge.
Right, the closed loop.
Yeah. Then early Buddhism was introduced as an open source framework. It was accessible to the merchants, the artisans, and the broader public, regardless of their birth caste.
That is a highly functional way to look at it, actually.
Anyone could download the code of the Eightfold Path, run it through their own daily actions and meditation, and achieve the result themselves.
The emphasis on personal effort and ethical conduct over birthright resonated deeply with the merchant classes we discussed earlier.
Makes total sense.
And Buddhism was one of several heterodox movements that arose in this climate, Jainism being another highly significant one.
Right.
But Buddhism's particular emphasis on a middle way gave it a uniquely broad appeal. The Buddha explicitly rejected both the extreme, punishing physical asceticism practiced by some sramanas, like starving oneself to the point of emaciation.
Yeah, and the extreme sensual indulgence of ordinary worldly life.
Exactly. This practical, balanced approach made it accessible not just to hardcore forest ascetics, but to urban lay people and merchants who could support the movement financially while still participating in society.
But that raises a massive immediate logistical issue.
Oh, definitely.
How do you preserve this open source philosophy after the founder dies? Especially in a society that does not use written texts for spiritual matters.
Right, that's the big problem.
We are talking about preserving incredibly detailed philosophical discourses, ethical rules, and meditation techniques through human memory alone.
Yeah, because written language in ancient India at that time was primarily utilized for military administration or merchant accounting.
It was for tracking grain shipments and taxes, not for recording the complex nuances of metaphysics.
It requires a profound shift in perspective to realize that for the first 400 years after the Buddha's passing, his highly complex teachings were transmitted entirely orally.
400 years.
Yeah. It highlights the extraordinary systematic capacity for memorization cultivated in Indian and later Tibetan traditions. We are talking about an educational system built entirely around the capabilities of the human mind, honed through rigorous collective discipline.
This specific challenge leads us right to the first Buddhist council. It was convened at the city of Rajagriha in the 5th century BCE, just 3 months after the Buddha's parinirvana.
And parinirvana refers to his final passing away, his final release from the physical body and the cycle of rebirth.
Right. The council was held in a cave complex and presided over by a senior elder monk named Mahakashapa.
And it was attended by 500 arhats.
An arhat is considered a fully liberated being, someone who has completely eradicated craving and achieved enlightenment.
Yeah. And because everything relied entirely on memory, They divided the labor of recitation based on individual expertise.
The division was highly structured. You had Ananda, who was the Buddha's cousin, and his longtime personal attendant.
And Ananda possessed a famously perfect eidetic memory.
He was tasked with reciting the sutras. The sutras are the actual discourses, the sermons, dealing with the themes of practice, morality, and concentration.
Then you had a monk named Upali. He was previously a barber from a lower caste before joining the order.
Which again highlights the egalitarian nature of the early community.
Absolutely. Upali recited the Vinaya, which constitutes the comprehensive rules of monastic discipline.
And according to some historical accounts, Mahakashapa himself recited the Abhidharma, which deals with the higher teachings, the complex metaphysics, and the categorization of physical and mental phenomena.
Okay, but I have to pause and push back on this a little.
Okay, sure.
Because for you listening, we really need to think about the reality of human memory. Consider how quickly a simple message degrades in a game of telephone.
Oh, yeah.
You whisper a sentence to the person next to you, and by the time it goes around a circle of 10 people, the original meaning is completely distorted, if not entirely lost.
Right.
So how can we trust the reliability of human memory to perfectly preserve vast, highly technical, philosophical treatises over multiple centuries without a single written word?
Well, it is a completely valid skepticism, especially from a modern perspective where we are so heavily reliant on external storage like books and hard drives.
Yeah, exactly.
However, the method of transmission they developed was not at all like a game of telephone.
A game of telephone relies on whispered, single iteration, linear transmission that is actually designed to fail for our amusement. The oral transmission of the early Buddhist texts was based on rigorous, systematic group recitation.
Known as Sangiti, right?
Yes, Seniki, which literally means chanting together.
So they weren't just passing a single thread of knowledge from one master to one student in isolation.
Precisely. A large group of monks would chant the texts together simultaneously out loud, often on a daily basis.
Oh, okay.
If one person misremembered a word or dropped a syllable, the collective voice of the hundreds of others would immediately correct it.
So it was a highly redundant, self-correcting communal memory system.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Furthermore, the texts themselves were structured with deep rhythmic patterns, numbered lists, and repetitive formulas specifically designed to aid mnemonic retention.
That structural design makes a lot of sense. And when we look at the content they were memorizing, particularly the Vinaya, the rule book recited by Upali, it is crucial to understand how those rules actually functioned. They were not handed down as a rigid, top-down list of commandments demanding strict obedience in the Western judicial sense.
That is a vital distinction. The Vinaya was created cumulatively, essentially acting as monastic case law.
Case law.
Yeah. When the community of monks encountered a specific practical problem, say a dispute over clothing or interacting with lay people or handling food, the Buddha would be consulted, and he would lay down a rule to address that specific situation.
So it was practical dispute resolution designed to maintain harmony within the community.
And to maintain a respectable image to the lay public who provided their food.
Right, so they have this perfect communal memory system, and they have a practical case law approach to discipline. But memory and case law do not solve arguments about completely new socioeconomic situations.
Oh, they don't.
As the community grew and spread geographically away from the Ganges Plain over the decades, different regions faced different practical realities.
Yeah.
If a monk in a wealthy merchant city is handed a new type of currency, the old texts memorized by Upali might not explicitly state what to do. How do they handle a crisis that wasn't about a failure of memory, but about a need for adaptation?
That pressure point leads directly to the Second Buddhist Council, held at the city of Vaishali in either 386 BCE or 376 BCE.
And the catalyst for this massive gathering was remarkably mundane. It was a dispute over 10 specific practices, the most contentious being whether monks were allowed to handle gold and silver.
Essentially a dispute over money.
Why is a gold coin such a monumental issue for a monk?
Because the entire monastic identity was built on the concept of alms. Monks were supposed to wander, owning nothing but their robes and a begging bowl.
Relying daily on the generosity of lay community for food.
Right. Handling money means storing wealth. Stored wealth leads to property acquisition, which ties the monk back into the very worldly attachments and economic anxieties they had renounced.
But for monks living near major, bustling trade routes, completely refusing the local currency became practically difficult when attempting to secure basic provisions or repair shelters.
Exactly. And this mundane dispute created a massive ideological split. On one side, you had the conservative faction known as the Theravada, or the propounders, according to the elders.
They insisted on strict, literal adherence to the original rules, arguing absolutely against the handling of money, regardless of the changing economic landscape.
Yes. On the other side was a group that formed the Mahasanghika, meaning the majority community. They favored a degree of flexibility and adaptation to changing socioeconomic realities.
But the fracture went much deeper than accounting practices, didn't it?
Oh, much deeper. The historical texts explicitly note that this practical dispute over the gold coin cracked open a much deeper theological and philosophical debate about the fundamental nature of the arhats themselves.
Right, the arhats being those fully liberated beings who attended the first council. What was there to debate about them?
The Mahasanghikas began to argue that arhats, despite having achieved liberation from rebirth, were still essentially human in their physical forms.
And therefore still subject to certain human frailties and physiological limitations.
Yeah. The texts specifically mention intense debates over whether an arhat could experience doubt, whether they could be taught by others, and crucially, whether they could experience erotic dreams and nocturnal emissions.
That is a highly specific and biological point of contention for a theological debate.
It was centrally important because it defined the ultimate goal of the practice. The conservative Theravadins minimized the gap between an arhat and a fully enlightened Buddha, seeing them as quite similar in their absolute purity.
But the Mahasanghikas argued that a Buddha was a completely transcendent being.
Right, entirely uninfluenced by such human bodily functions or limitations. This effectively widened the conceptual gap between an arhat, a liberated human, and a Buddha, who is becoming something much more vast.
That conceptual widening is the crucial wedge. It laid the very early intellectual groundwork for what would eventually become the massive Mahayana movement centuries later, where the figure of the Buddha becomes increasingly elevated, eternal, and superhuman.
Absolutely.
And these internal debates only grew more complex as time went on. By the time we reached the Third Buddhist Council, which was held in the capital city of Pataliputra in either 247 BCE or 237 BCE, the debates had moved far beyond gold coins and biology.
They had become profoundly metaphysical.
This council saw the split of a major tradition known as the Sarvastivada from the Theravadians over the fundamental nature of time and matter.
The escalation and the complexity of these debates makes perfect sense when we look at the structural design of the monastic community. These early schisms stem directly from the absence of a central, infallible authority figure.
Right, there was no Buddhist pope.
Exactly. The Buddha intentionally structured the Sangha, the monastic community, to be highly egalitarian and decentralized. There was no single leader appointed to dictate doctrine or enforce uniformity after his death.
The law was the memory of the texts and the consensus of the local community.
Without a central enforcer to silence dissenting views, democratic councils had to convene to debate varying interpretations.
And when you have thousands of highly educated monks spending decades intensely analyzing the granular nature of reality through meditation and logic, the debates naturally move from practical discipline to profound philosophical inquiry.
Naturally. Let's unpack the specific philosophical inquiry of the Sarvastivadins because it sounds remarkably like modern physics.
Yeah, the Sarvastivadins argued for an atomic theory of time and matter.
The very name Sarvastivada translates roughly to the theory that all exists.
They asserted that matter consists of indivisible fundamental particles called dharmas, and the radical claim was that these particles exist continuously across the past, the present, and the future. Only their specific configuration or their state of activity changes.
It is a highly complex ontology. To understand it, think of time not as a flowing river where the past disappears forever, but more like a physical block.
Okay.
The Sarvastivadins argued that for the law of karma to function, for an action in the past to produce a specific result in the future, the past action must possess some continuous underlying ontological reality.
Right, it cannot simply vanish into nothingness, or else how does it bridge the gap of time to cause the future result?
Precisely. Therefore, the fundamental building blocks of past, present, and future all exist simultaneously.
So if we use a modern analogy, they are viewing reality like a strip of movie film. All the frames, the past scenes, the present scene, the future scenes exist simultaneously on the physical celluloid strip.
That is an excellent way to visualize it.
Our conscious experience is just the projector light moving across one frame at a time, making it the active present. But the past frames haven't vanished. And the future frames are already there on the strip.
Yeah, the Theravadins, conversely, vehemently rejected this. They argued for strict momentariness.
Waiting.
They stated that only present phenomena exist, the past is entirely gone, and the future is not yet here. Only the immediate, fleeting present moment have actual reality.
It is incredible to consider how a community goes from debating the basic rules of begging for food in the forest to debating the fundamental fabric of space-time.
It really is a massive jump.
But what is truly significant for our timeline is that these massive internal philosophical schisms did not weaken the movement or cause it to collapse. On the contrary, this ideological fragmentation resulted in diverse branches of thought, each uniquely suited to the different regions where Buddhism was taking root.
And those regions were expanding rapidly. The geographic dispersion of these different schools aligned perfectly with expanding trade networks and massive imperial ambitions.
The pivotal, transformative moment for this geographic expansion is the rise of the Mauryan Empire.
Specifically, the reign of Emperor Ashoka.
Right, who ruled from roughly 268 to 232 BCE. Ashoka's impact on the history of Buddhism cannot be overstated.
He inherited a massive empire that encompassed nearly the entire Indian subcontinent. And early in his reign, he launched a brutal military conquest against the state of Kalinga, located on the eastern coast.
The historical accounts of the Kalinga War describe immense horror. The texts claim 100,000 people were killed and 150,000 were deported.
The sheer scale of the carnage, the displacement, and the suffering caused Ashoka to experience a profound, well-documented crisis of conscience.
He converted to Buddhism.
He did, and he fundamentally altered the entire policy of his state.
He abandoned the traditional model of military expansion. Instead, he instituted a policy he called Dharma Vijaya, which translates to conquest by dharma, or righteous conduct.
He utilized the vast administrative machinery of his empire to actively promote ethical behavior, nonviolence, and social welfare.
And we know this because he physically carved his new policies into the landscape.
Yeah, the famous rock and pillar edicts.
He disseminated his message through this vast network of rock and pillar edicts. These were massive stone columns, some weighing 50 tons, erected in public gathering spaces and along major trade routes across the subcontinent.
And they were inscribed not just in a single elite language, but in various local scripts, including Greek and Aramaic in the northwestern borderlands.
The edicts explicitly advocated compassion toward all living beings, the fair treatment of servants, religious tolerance, and massive public works programs.
Like planting medicinal herbs, digging wells, and building rest houses along the roads.
Ashoka essentially utilized the logistical power of an Iron Age empire to broadcast the ethical core of Buddhism.
Furthermore, he became a massive sponsor of active Buddhist missions.
Yeah, he dispatched envoys far beyond his borders. He sent missions south to Sri Lanka, north to the Himalayan regions of Kashmir, and far to the west, out into the Hellenistic world, ruled by the successors of Alexander the Great.
The historical sources indicate these missions reached the courts of kings in Egypt, Syria, and Macedonia.
They even influenced figures as far away as Hegesias of Cyrene, a Greek philosopher in North Africa, whose philosophical pessimism shows striking parallels to early Buddhist thought regarding the cessation of desire.
But beyond royal edicts and official diplomatic missions, the real sustained engine of expansion was the daily symbiosis of monks and merchants.
This is a critical dynamic. As the trade routes expanded, a highly functional moral economy of merit developed.
Wealthy merchants, seeking both spiritual security and physical infrastructure along dangerous trade routes, would fund the construction of elaborate Buddhist monuments.
They built massive stupas, which are large hemispherical structures containing sacred relics, like the famous Great Stupa at Sanchi.
They also funded the excavation of extensive multi-story cave monasteries carved directly into the sides of mountains in regions like the Western Ghats.
In exchange for this massive capital investment, the merchants earned religious merit,
which was believed to ensure prosperity in this life and favorable conditions in their future rebirths.
So what does this all mean functionally? Let's put you in the shoes of a merchant traveling the Silk Road in the 1st century CE. You are carrying highly valuable goods, silk, spices, precious stones, across treacherous, arid terrain.
Moving through regions with shifting political alliances and constant threats of banditry.
You're following the major trade arteries, specifically the northern route, the Uttarapatha, leading out of India towards Central Asia.
As you travel this dangerous road, you arrive at a fortified Buddhist monastery complex.
Inside those thick stone walls, you find monks who share your basic language of commerce. Crucially, These monks are not bound by the strict isolating purity laws and caste restrictions of the Brahmanical system back home.
Right, which often look down upon extensive travel and mingling with foreigners.
Exactly. The monastery offers you secure lodging, a safe place to store your goods, and sanctuary, regardless of your social birth or nationality.
They essentially acted as ancient banking outposts and secure caravanserais.
The practical business advantages of funding a non-caste-based, highly organized, and literate religious institution along international trade routes are immense. The religion provided the exact infrastructure the trade network required.
And this relationship deepened profoundly under the Kushan Empire, which dominated Central Asia and northern India in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE.
The Kushan Emperor Kanishka was a major patron.
Yes. He convened another massive council, often called the Fourth Council, in the region of Kashmir specifically to compile and standardize the complex Sarvastivada teachings we discussed earlier,
resulting in massive new commentaries.
The Kushan period is also where we see a striking, highly visible fusion of cultures.
Because of the lingering legacy of Alexander the Great's conquests in the region centuries prior, Greek artistic techniques and aesthetics merged directly with Buddhist theology in the region of Gandhara, which is in modern-day Pakistan and Afghanistan.
This cultural collision resulted in something entirely new. Prior to this, the Buddha was never depicted in human form.
He was represented by symbols, a footprint, an empty throne, the Bodhi tree.
But in Gandhara, artisans began creating the very first human anthropomorphic statues of the Buddha.
And if you look at them, they are heavily influenced by the visual conventions used to depict Greek deities, specifically the sun god Apollo.
The Buddha is shown wearing heavy toga-like draped robes, possessing a serene, classical Greek profile.
And often accompanied by a figure that looks exactly like Hercules acting as his bodyguard.
That physical artistic fusion is a perfect visual representation of the broader structural process occurring at the time. State sponsorship and vast merchant wealth fundamentally transformed the religion.
Buddhism adapted from a localized ascetic practice consisting of wandering monks begging for daily food into a massive, sedentary, and heavily capitalized institution.
It became capable of managing large agricultural estates, maintaining complex hydraulic irrigation systems for local farmers,
facilitating long-distance international trade, and providing vital political legitimation to ambitious multicultural rulers like Kanishka.
The religion became deeply intertwined with the heavy mechanics of empire and commerce,
which perfectly sets the stage for a period of immense intellectual output, but also hidden structural danger. We are entering the zenith of universities and ideological shifts.
Because with massive wealth flowing in from imperial patrons and international trade routes, the physical and intellectual architecture of Buddhism fundamentally changed again.
We move into the Gupta and Pala eras, stretching roughly from the 4th century to the 12th century CE. During this vast, extensive time, the tradition transitions almost completely away from the ideal of wandering monks in the forest.
And into settled, incredibly massive monastic universities known as Mahaviharas.
We are talking about legendary, sprawling institutions like Nalanda, Taxila, and Vikramasila.
The scale and sophistication of these Mahaviharas were unprecedented in the ancient world. They functioned as the premier intellectual centers of Asia.
Nalanda, for instance, housed thousands of monks and students at its peak.
It featured towering, multi-story brick buildings, extensive lecture halls, and a massive legendary library complex known as the Dharmaganja.
Which means the treasury of truth.
Yeah.
And as the physical institutions grew in size and wealth, the curriculum expanded far beyond the original teaching.
Right. The monks were no longer exclusively memorizing the sutras and the rules of the Vinaya.
To operate at this elite level, the curriculum expanded to include rigorous, specialized training in formal logic, epistemology, Sanskrit grammar, medicine, astronomy, and incredibly complex esoteric metaphysics.
To even gain entry into Nalanda, a prospective student had to pass a grueling verbal examination administered by a gatekeeper monk who was essentially a master of debate and logic.
They were attracting the sharpest scholars from across the entire continent.
From China, from Tibet, from Korea, and from Southeast Asia.
It is remarkably similar to the evolution of the modern elite university system. You have a movement that starts as a grassroots, practical philosophical inquiry in the forests.
And over centuries, it evolves into a heavily funded, highly exclusive academic institution.
With complex entry requirements, vast libraries, specialized academic departments, and intense peer review through public debate.
And within these elite, highly literate environments, the core ideology shifts dramatically once again.
This is when the movement known as Mahayana, meaning the Great Vehicle, emerges prominently and becomes systematized.
It initially gained traction in the southern Indian Andhra region before sweeping into the universities.
Under the Mahayana framework, the concept of the Buddha is fully elevated. He is no longer just a historical human teacher who achieved liberation and passed away.
He becomes an eternal, omniscient, superhuman figure, a cosmic principle of enlightenment manifesting across infinite universes.
And along with this theological elevation, there is a distinct shift in daily religious practice.
In the earlier traditions, merit was often generated by venerating physical relics, like bone fragments or ashes of the Buddha enshrined in stupas.
But in the Mahayana tradition, particularly within the university environment, the emphasis shifts heavily to the textual study, copying, and recitation of entirely new scriptures, known as the Mahayana Sutras.
A prime example is the Prajnaparamita, or the perfection of wisdom literature.
Here's where it gets really interesting regarding the mechanics of these texts. The new texts themselves explicitly assert that copying, memorizing, and reciting these physical scriptures brings millions of times more religious merit than simply offering incense or flowers at a physical shrine.
They elevate the text itself to the status of a relic.
It is a philosophy perfectly calibrated for a highly literate, text-obsessed, monastic university culture.
It absolutely reflects the environment of the Mahaviharas. And following the rise and systematization of Mahayana, we also see the emergence of Vajrayana, or Tantric Buddhism.
This developed prominently under the patronage of the Pella dynasty in eastern India, roughly from the 8th century onward.
Vajrayana incorporated highly esoteric practices, complex visualization techniques, and the extensive use of dharanis.
Let's clearly define a dharani because it sounds somewhat mystical. They are often described as short formulas or magical spells. But what function were they actually serving for these scholars?
While they did acquire a reputation for magical efficacy among the lay public, used for protection or bringing rain within the monastic context, dharanis were incredibly dense cognitive tools.
Okay, cognitive tools.
Yeah, they were short, highly concentrated mnemonic formulas or mantras repeated constantly. The purpose was to hold vast, complex amounts of conceptual framework in the mind simultaneously during deep meditation. It was a technology of mindfulness and spiritual power.
And this development of Vajrayana was heavily influenced by and in dialogue with concurrent developments in Hindu Tantrism and Shaivism occurring in the exact same geographic areas.
It shows a highly porous intellectual boundary between the religious traditions at the elite, esoteric level. They were sharing techniques and terminology.
But this massive institutional success, the wealth, the towering brick universities, the elite intellectualism, carried a hidden, ultimately fatal structural risk.
The risk was profound isolation. As the monasteries grew into massive, sprawling universities, they became wealthy institutional landowners.
They were entirely dependent on royal land grants for their survival.
A single university like Nalanda collected agricultural taxes and labor from dozens, sometimes hundreds, of surrounding villages just to feed its thousands of non-producing monks.
And as a direct result of this massive centralized wealth, the monks became increasingly isolated behind high brick walls.
They were writing intricate Sanskrit commentaries on the nature of reality, but they were entirely disconnected from the everyday lives, the vernacular languages, and the practical struggles of the rural peasantry they had once served as wandering teachers centuries prior.
That isolation created a profound structural vulnerability. When the political and cultural winds eventually shifted, these massive institutions simply could not sustain themselves.
They had lost their grassroots support system. The average farmer in the village providing grain to the university had no connection to the debates happening inside.
This brings us directly to the slow fade and the fatal blow to Buddhism in India. The decline was not a single event.
No, it was driven by a complex combination of internal philosophical shifts, massive societal changes at the village level, and brutal external shocks.
Internally, there was a vast, slow movement of absorption and convergence with Hinduism. We need to look closely at what was happening on the ground level, outside the university walls.
A massive religious shift known as the Bhakti movement was gaining immense momentum within Hinduism.
Bhakti emphasized accessible, passionate, and deeply personal devotion to specific deities, like Shiva or Vishnu.
Crucially, this devotion was often conveyed through ecstatic singing and poetry in the local vernacular languages, not in elite Sanskrit.
The contrast is stark. This emotional, egalitarian devotion of the Bhakti movement completely outcompeted the highly intellectual, Sanskrit-heavy, heavily regulated monastic Buddhism of the universities.
The everyday person found the passionate singing of the Bhakti saints far more relatable and spiritually fulfilling than attempting to understand complex debates over atomic theory or reciting esoteric Dharanis.
Furthermore, Brahmanism proved to be incredibly adept at theological assimilation. It actively adopted many popular Buddhist ethical tenets.
For example, the promotion of strict vegetarianism, which was originally a strong Buddhist and Jain critique of Vedic animal sacrifice, was eventually adopted by the Brahmin caste as a marker of their own supreme purity.
And, even more significantly, they conceptually absorbed the figure of the Buddha himself.
That absorption is a masterclass in theological incorporation. Orthodox Hindu texts, like the Puranas, began framing the Buddha not as a radical reformer who rejected the Vedas, but simply as the ninth avatar or physical incarnation of the supreme Hindu god Vishnu.
They argued Vishnu descended as the Buddha, specifically to delude the wicked or to stop animal sacrifice.
Regardless of the specific narrative justification, the practical effect was massive. It effectively brought Buddhist followers and pilgrimage sites back into the expansive, accommodating fold of Hinduism. You didn't need to be a Buddhist to worship the Buddha. You could just worship him as a form of Vishnu.
Intellectually, Buddhism was also facing fierce, systematic opposition. Philosophers like Adi Shankara, who lived around the 8th century, aggressively critiqued Buddhist metaphysics in highly publicized debates.
Shankara utilized sophisticated logic to attack the Buddhist concepts of momentariness and the lack of a permanent self, effectively reclaiming elite intellectual dominance for Brahmanical thought.
So you have a situation where the ground was already severely eroding beneath the heavy foundations of the Mahaviharas.
Yeah.
The grassroots support was gone, assimilated by Bhakti, and the intellectual high ground was being fiercely contested.
And then the external invasions began. The wealth of these concentrated institutions made them massive targets.
In the 6th century, the White Hun invasion swept down into the northwest.
These nomadic armies severely disrupted the vital international Silk Road trade routes that had funded the northern monasteries for centuries, and they physically destroyed many early crucial Buddhist centers in regions like Gandhara. The economic lifeline was severed.
And then came the Turkic and Islamic military conquests, stretching from the 10th to the 12th centuries. It is important to note the historical record, impartially here, focusing on the mechanics of the conflict.
The incoming armies, operating from an entirely different theological framework, viewed these massive, wealthy monastic centers filled with statues and gold as un-Islamic idol temples.
They were perceived not as universities, but as centers of a competing alien religion and as prime, heavily concentrated targets for military plunder.
The decisive, devastating blow came in 1193. A Turkish military raider named Bakhtiar Khilji led an army into eastern India and attacked Nalanda University.
The destruction was absolute. According to the surviving historical accounts, the massive libraries, the Dharmaganja we mentioned earlier, burned for months.
Thousands of monks were killed or forced to scatter. This single event effectively ended institutional Buddhism in its Indian heartland.
I want you to consider the extreme fragility of highly centralized knowledge. If your entire religious and intellectual infrastructure, the texts, the teachers, the lineages, the philosophy, is housed in a few massive, concentrated universities dependent on royal funding, what happens when an army breaches the walls and burns the library down?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the contrast with how Hinduism survived these exact same invasions is highly illuminating.
How so?
Hinduism was fundamentally decentralized. It was deeply, inextricably embedded in the daily domestic rituals of the family unit, the small village shrines, the local festivals, and the dispersed network of local Brahmin priests. It did not require a massive centralized university or a royal decree to survive on a daily basis.
Buddhism, however, had become dangerously top-heavy.
It was completely reliant on the centralized monastic sangha and the elite royal patrons who funded their estates. Once the monasteries were physically destroyed, the libraries burned, and the royal patrons were either eliminated in battle or converted to the new ruling religion, Buddhism had no grassroots infrastructure to fall back on.
The village structures had already been absorbed by the Bhakti movement.
The few monks who survived the fires fled north into the high Himalayas, into Tibet, and east into Southeast Asia, carrying whatever manuscripts they could carry. The religion effectively vanished from the plains of its birth.
But the story doesn't end in the ashes of Nalanda. Though institutional Buddhism vanished from the Indian plains for nearly 8 centuries, surviving only in the high-altitude Himalayan border regions like Ladakh and Sikkim, its massive physical ruins, the buried stupas, the broken pillars, the collapsed scroll walls, left a physical trail of breadcrumbs for its eventual, highly unexpected revival.
This leads us to the modern resurrection.
The initial phase of this resurrection was driven entirely by external curiosity. In the 19th century, British colonial officials, surveyors, and amateur archaeologists began unearthing the forgotten past.
They found massive stone pillars covered in an unknown script. They found massive earth mounds that clearly contained ancient structures.
The breakthrough came in 1837. An official named James Prinsep, working at the Asiatic Society in Calcutta, spent years meticulously cross-referencing bilingual coins and inscriptions until he finally deciphered the ancient Brahmi script.
For the first time in millennia, the massive rock edicts of Emperor Ashoka could actually be read.
The lost history of a massive, peaceful Buddhist empire was suddenly legible.
Later, in 1854, the archaeologist Alexander Cunningham systematically excavated the Great Stupa at Sanchi, revealing the stunning, intricate stone carvings that depicted the life of the Buddha and the complex society of early India.
These archaeological and philological discoveries sparked a massive wave of renewed international interest. It led to the founding of the Mahabodhi Society in 1891 by a Sri Lankan Buddhist leader named Anagarika Dharmapala.
The Society's primary mission was an international effort to reclaim and physically restore the dilapidated sacred Buddhist sites in India, most notably the Mahabodhi Temple at Bodh Gaya, the exact geographical site where Siddhartha Gautama had attained enlightenment under the Bodhi tree.
But while the archaeology recovered the stones, the true socio-political revival of Buddhism as a living religion in India happened in the middle of the 20th century.
And it was spearheaded not by an archaeologist or a foreign monk, but by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, a brilliant scholar, a jurist, and the principal architect of the independent Indian constitution.
Dr. Ambedkar's background is the crucial context here. He belonged to the Dalit community, the group formerly classified as untouchables at the absolute suppressed bottom of the traditional Hindu caste system.
Despite his immense education and intellectual achievements, he faced severe, systemic social discrimination throughout his life.
After decades of fighting for political representation and basic social rights for Dalits within the existing Hindu framework, he came to a radical conclusion.
He determined that true social liberation and human dignity within a religion fundamentally based on inherited caste hierarchy was mathematically impossible.
So he looked for an alternative. He extensively studied various world religions. He eventually chose Buddhism, recognizing it as an indigenous Indian tradition that had historically rejected the authority of the Vedas and the caste system.
On October 14, 1956, in the city of Nagpur, Ambedkar led a historic, unprecedented mass conversion. Over 500,000 Dalits followed him in taking the traditional Buddhist vows,
Embracing a new, specifically tailored school of Buddhism, which he termed Navayana, or the new vehicle.
Navayana represents a fascinating, highly specific, modern adaptation of the ancient philosophy.
It was a conscious, deliberate rejection of the Hindu caste system and its associated deities. But Ambedkar also explicitly discarded traditional Buddhist doctrines that he found socially problematic or scientifically unsound.
For instance, he rejected the traditional, fatalistic interpretations of karma and rebirth, arguing that these concepts had historically been weaponized to justify the poverty and suffering of the lower castes.
He essentially argued, you are not suffering in this life because you did something bad in a past life. You are suffering because of systemic present-day social oppression.
Precisely. Instead of focusing on esoteric metaphysics or escaping the cycle of rebirth, Navayana reframed the core of Buddhism entirely around modern practical principles of social egalitarianism, intense rationalism education, and the immediate pursuit of social justice in this current life.
He stripped away the supernatural elements to focus on the Buddha's ethical and social teachings.
It is a profound structural historical rhyme. Think about the mechanics of what we have discussed today.
Just as the rising merchant classes in the 5th century BCE used early open-source Buddhism to bypass the rigid, exclusive Vedic social hierarchy of the Brahmin priests and find a system that matched their reality.
Highly marginalized groups in 1956 used the exact same underlying philosophy for modern political and social liberation.
They both found practical freedom in the adaptable nature of the Buddha's core teachings.
It perfectly synthesizes a massive, multi-millennial historical cycle. Buddhism was not reintroduced to the Indian masses by foreign missionaries arriving from East Asia or Tibet with new texts.
It was resurrected by Indians themselves, actively reclaiming an ancient indigenous philosophical tool to solve highly contemporary, urgent political and social challenges. The tradition adapted once again, proving its enduring ideological flexibility.
And as we bring this massive journey to a close, looking back at a timeline stretching over 2.5 millennia, from a wandering ascetic in the forest to the burning of massive universities, and finally to a political mass conversion in a modern city, it is worth reflecting on how we even comprehend a history this vast.
Throughout this deep dive, we have traced a very linear path for you. A definitive beginning with the Buddha, a steady rise under Emperor Ashoka, a golden age of towering universities, a sharp, violent decline and fall, and a triumphant modern rebirth.
But this brings us to a final provocative thought to leave you with, one that questions the very structure of our narrative.
The Western concept of history, the framework we use to organize these events, is inherently linear. It assumes a definitive start point, a steady progression of cause and effect, and a move toward an ultimate final end. It is a straight line drawn across a page.
But the traditional Indian, and specifically the Buddhist view of time, is entirely nonlinear. They view time as endless, repeating, cyclical loops.
They envision vast cosmic eons called kalpas, of immense expansion and contraction, periods of great moral elevation followed inevitably by deep degeneration, without any definitive absolute beginning or apocalyptic end.
Within their own theological framework, the historical figure of Siddhartha Gautama is not the absolute beginning. He is just one specific Buddha in an endless, repeating sequence of Buddhas who appear when the teachings have been entirely forgotten by humanity, only for those teachings to eventually, inevitably, fade away again over millennia, waiting for the cycle to repeat.
This raises an important question. When we study the so-called rise and fall of Buddhism in India, using our neat linear timelines and our focus on physical empires and universities, are we truly seeing the objective truth of the past? Or are we simply applying our own culturally specific linear mental constructs to aggressively organize the chaotic, moment-to-moment experiences of millions of ancient people? When we map out a history this vast, are we discovering the true shape of time, or are we just looking at our own reflection in the mirror of the past? Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.